investigate the matter.
Many thanks. And it's now time to move to the next item of business, which is a Health and Sport Committee debate on access to new medicines. I'd invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. And Mr McNeill, if you are ready, I would invite you to open the debate on behalf of the Health and Sport Committee. You have 14 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Thanks also to the Clerk, Spice, all of those who gave of their time and written evidence and participated in the public sessions. And maybe just as importantly, all of those people who came forward over this period at a very, very difficult and vulnerable time in their life and spoke out about the failings that were resulting in the patient experience. And I'm speaking on behalf of the Youthjack family and my own constituency, and Anne Fisher, sadly deceased, and her family, who spoke out at a very difficult time. And I think all of that contribution ensured that the Health and Sport Committee approached this whole issue with a sensitivity and an approach of consensus. To say that it was a big issue and complex and deeply emotive, of course it was. The committee first looked at the matter in March 2012 when we received a trio of petitions on orphan medicines. Now, as they say, the science bit. Orphan medicines are those used to treat very rare diseases. We learned a lot in the past 18 months, and I hope to share some of it with you in the next 13 minutes. I want to retrace our steps, a reminder of why we are discussing this today, along with the usual who, what and when. I'll set out the main findings of the report we published in early July, the how. I shall also offer some thoughts on yesterday's statement from the Cabinet Secretary, the where we're headed to bit. My colleagues on the Public Petitions Committee deserve credit too for their role in this story. It was with their committee the petitioners first raised these concerns. The petitioners being Alistair Kent, Alan Muir, Leslie Lollinger and Professor Peter Hillman. Individuals working on behalf of Rare Disease UK, Glycogen Storage Disease and PNH Scotland, respectively. All would, I am sure, acknowledge work on an earlier petition, of course, in 2008 from Tina McKeever on behalf of the late Mike Gray. A petition that resulted in the revision of the guidelines to the end-to-end process, by which I mean the licensing of medicines through to individual patient treatment requests, or IPTRs. The petitioners argued that the revision had not resulted in improved access to orphan medicines for patients with rare diseases. We took evidence last March from the petitioners themselves, followed by the Scottish Medicines Consortium, the SMC, and the Association of Pharmaceutical Industry, ABPI. Apologies, Presiding Officer, for all of those acronyms there. It's like the Secret Service convention or something. We followed up with evidence from clinicians and patient representative bodies. On the 14th of November 2012, the Cabinet Secretary announced the Routledge and Swainson reviews. The committee heard from the authors of the reviews, the Cabinet Secretary and the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer on the 7th of May 2013. On the 21st of May, we held further roundtable sessions with interested parties to gauge reaction to the twin reviews. The report of our own findings was published on the 3rd of July. The committee found an enthusiasm from all quarters to work together to improve the system for accessing new medicines, a system enabling a wider assessment of their value, with more of what might be termed societal dimension. Our report welcomed the recommendations from Swainson and Routledge, but we wanted to improve both the IPTR and the SMC processes to ensure a more transparent system for assessing new medicines. In short, We wanted more yeses. Many of the suggestions in the review, meeting in public, standardisation of paperwork, monitoring of the applications, publications of the decisions, etc., were welcome, but they were about process and would do little to improve access. One of the difficulties with the IPTR system was in establishing the exceptionality of patient circumstances. We said to the Scottish Government, the Scottish Government must outline steps it would take to improve this. Decisions on whether to recommend a medicine for use in Scotland depended on cost of the additional quality adjusted life years, or QALY. I hope the reporters have got a glossary here, because there's a lot of this. Nobody told us of a better system in the QALY for assessing the value of competing treatments. Who knew an equation could be so difficult, so brutal, so hard? Cost divided by how many weeks your life may be extended. But in the way in which so-called modifiers are applied, it is crucial in determining the cost-effectiveness of medicines. We asked the SMC and the Scottish Government to review how modifiers and thresholds were applied, to take better account of orphan and ultra-orphan conditions, end-of-life and innovation. Our work began with those orphan and ultra-orphan petitions, after all. We welcomed the interim £21 million Rare Conditions Medicine Fund, but questions remained about the extent to which the fund could improve access to these medicines. The committee said clear guidance should be published. Decisions about specific cancer medicines should, we said, be made on the same basis as other conditions. Cancer should not be singled out in comparison with other life-shortening conditions. The committee accepted this was a difficult issue. Nevertheless, we did not believe a cancer drug fund was the Scottish answer. The committee recognised concerns about the impact of innovative medicines not being routinely available in Scotland. We requested the Scottish Government to investigate. Likewise, we said developments with the value-based pricing, that VBP, should be monitored. And I'm afraid I don't have time to tell you about ADTCs or PPRS or indeed NICE. Nice but naughty, if you like. Speaking of which, Presiding Officer, it was only yesterday morning that we received a copy of the Scottish Government's response to our report. A shame that, but we would have liked to have given it full consideration and come to a view as a committee. What I can say is that I appreciate the language and the intention of what is being proposed. The Cabinet Secretary wants to move to a more flexible approach, evaluating medicines for end-of-life care and rare conditions. He wants to increase access to new medicines. Good. The committee and the Cabinet Secretary are on the same page, Presiding Officer, but we need to see the detail. It's where the devil lurks, as always. The Scottish Government say value-based pricing won't be delivered. It believes that pricing element of pharmaceutical price regulation is a reserved matter, but medicines assessment is devolved, and it will develop a new value-based assessment, or VBA, process for Scotland. As a first step, the SMC has begun to look at the evaluation of orphan and ultra-orphan end-of-life medicines. This is only to include a review of the wider aspects of value, quality and increased access to those medicines. The SMC are due to report their findings to the Cabinet Secretary before Christmas. It says it in the report. I love deadlines. I like that whooshing sound as they fly by, as someone said. And let this please be one of those deadlines we are able to stick to. It is particularly important for those who have been diagnosed with some of these conditions last week, today, tomorrow and next week, and some consideration may be given to them about how they operate in this transitional phase. But we need to stick to that deadline. The IPTR system is being replaced with a new peer-approved clinical system. That's PACS. Guidance will be published shortly, we are told, and I would seek assurances that the old double act of postcode and lottery are not reunited by PACS. In all honesty, Presiding Officer, it's hard to tell whether the committee's recommendations will be matched by these new systems, as we are short of information. But I would be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary could offer some clues about timescales. We are told the Rare Conditions Medicines Fund will continue until 2016, but it's still unclear, however, whether the £20 million is an annual budget total funding until 2016. I'd be obliged if the Cabinet Secretary would elaborate on that issue. The Scottish Government agrees that there should be scope for a temporary pause in the appraisal process to permit further dialogue with the manufacturer. It was recommended from the Routledge and welcomed by the committee. The Scottish Government says that a pause would allow confidential discussion with the manufacturer about costs through new or improved patient access scheme, but no picture has emerged yet as to how this scheme would look. Another one for the Cabinet Secretary, patiently listening here, I appreciate that. You're getting writer's cramp, I hope, taking these notes down. There is to be £1 million funding for the SMC, engagement with the public and the pharmaceutical industry, but it's not clear whether more money would be required following the development of VBA. Scepticism is a good thing, Presiding Officer, but credit where credit is due. I sense the direction, as I've said, in which we're headed is the right one. The frustration for me is that we are still to arrive. I'd like to say something more on the cost side. Clearly, the Scottish Government considers there to be a devolved element here. I make a couple of observations to that. In March of this year, the Chief Executive Officer of GlaxoSmithKline described the often repeated $1 billion research and development price tag as one of the great myths of the industry. And I think that's significant and interesting. And the Doctors Without Borders said, it is true that innovation, new drugs can change the way we treat people and we need more of them. But innovation is of little use if people cannot access new treatments because they are so expensive. The pricing of medicines is in many ways a global issue. Big, complex, deeply emotive. You better believe it. But I want to comment on the inclusive and listening approach of the next speaker. We have come a long way policy-wise in the last 18 months. Things have moved relatively quickly since the committee took evidence, and we welcome the announcement. But it can never be quick enough, of course, for those people who are diagnosed with rare conditions and terminal illness. 3 months is a lifetime to them. I would hope the Cabinet Secretary will report back to us soon and progress by December, and perhaps give us an undertaking that, because the committee does believe that we can improve these processes, we can remove some of the bumps in what the clinicians call the patient journey, and we can devise a system that is fair, objective, transparent, robust and within our means. We need to ensure access to all of those with orphan and life-threatening diseases. It's what petitioners and patients petitioned this Parliament for. We owe them nothing less. They deserve nothing less. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now call on Alec Neil, Cabinet Secretary. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. I welcome this important debate on the highly complex and difficult issue of access to new medicines. And as Duncan McNeill pointed out, it's worth remembering that this issue was highlighted by the experience of patients through originally the Petitions Committee, and their voice was been put directly to this Parliament the way it should be. After consideration by the Petitions Committee, the matter was passed to the Health Committee for further detailed consideration, and as Duncan said, their inquiry took the time and evidence to explore the position very fully. I would like to thank both the Petitions Committee and the Health Committee, and in particular Duncan McNeill for his chairing of the Health Committee inquiry, for the rigorous and serious manner in which they approached this wide-ranging subject. Through the committee's questioning, a number of important aspects were crystallised, not least the desire for the development of a Scottish model of value and the shortcomings of the IPTR process. The committee's consensual and sensitive approach is one I commend and feel sure that we can continue that right across the chamber today and beyond. The committee heard from a wide range of views from the pharmaceutical industry, clinicians, patients' charities and from patients and their families, some of whom are with us in the gallery today. As you will see from a written response to the committee, we have accepted almost all of the committee's recommendations and those of Professor Routledge and Professor Swainson. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Professor Swainson and Professor Routledge for their efforts and their suggestions, which I believe will make the system much more transparent. The committee also broadly welcomed their recommendations, but recognised that more would have to be done to increase access, as spelt out by Duncan McNeill, and I agreed with that assessment. As time is short, Presiding Officer, I'll focus my response just now on a very brief overview of some of the steps we propose to take. Firstly, I want to describe the introduction of flexible decision-making for medicines licensed to treat patients at the end of life and medicines licensed to treat very rare conditions. I have directed the Scottish Medicines Consortium, the body which approves medicines for use within the National Health Service in Scotland, to apply a more flexible approach to evaluating medicines for end-of-life care and for treating very rare conditions to increase access to those medicines. The SMC will carry out a review by Christmas at the latest and establish new approaches to facilitate improved access to these medicines for patients in Scotland. This will be the first step in a wider process to determine Scotland's requirement to create a value-based approach to new medicines assessment. The second action is the introduction of a new peer-review clinical system to replace current individual or group patient treatment requests. New detailed guidance for NHS boards on the new arrangements is being developed and will issue shortly. The guidance will clarify that the peer-approved clinical system is a single national system. I want to emphasise that, a single national system which will be delivered locally. Yes, of course.
Christine Graham.
I think for the sake of people who are involved or becoming involved in the IPTR process at the moment, it would be helpful if shortly it could be given more clarity. Are we talking months? The idea of when this new system will be up and running. I appreciate it's early days, but I think it's important to narrow it.
The intention is to do this very early indeed, certainly within the next couple of months or so, because clearly, as Duncan McNeill pointed out, there are people who could be caught in the transition, which would be very unfair indeed, and we're very cognitive of that particular situation. I should point out, however, that something like 60% and plus of IPTRs are actually accepted, so we are talking about the 40% of the applications not accepted. In brief, the new system will be predicated on clinical opinion. Where all other treatment options have been exhausted, a lead clinician can make the case to clinical peers for a treatment which has either not been recommended for general use by the SMC or has not yet been submitted for approval. It will, for the first time, introduce standardised paperwork as a requirement. Healthcare Improvement Scotland, HIS, will continue robust auditing of decision-making about medicines considered under this new system and will facilitate the regular sharing of expertise between NHS boards across Scotland to eliminate unwarranted variation. The new system will be underpinned by a centralised patient support team to advise, support and advocate for patients and families to make it easier to understand and use. In terms of the Rare Conditions Medicines Fund, I am pleased to confirm the extension of the £20 million per annum Rare Conditions Medicines Fund. It was due to conclude in April 2014. It will now run until at least April 2016. The Scottish Government... Yes.
Ian McIntosh.
Is the Minister adding additional funds, £20 million per year, for each year to 2016, or is it simply the current £20 million will be used to fund the fund until 2016?
We're making available up to £20 million for this fund every year, but actually, so far to date, only £6.5 million of the current £20 million available has actually been spent. But in each year, there will be in each fiscal year, up to £20 million available. The Scottish Government believes that the introduction of value-based assessments of new medicines and the new interim arrangements I have described for medicines which are to be used to treat very rare diseases will significantly reduce the current use of individual patient treatment requests and in future of peer review. However, in recognition that medicines within these categories are often not routinely available, extending the Rare Conditions Medicines Fund will provide access to medicines to treat very rare diseases for people who have a successful IPTR request or its successor, the peer review approach. In terms of improvements to SMC submission arrangements, let me first of all state the SMC, the Scottish Medicines Consortium, is a globally respected health technology assessment organisation who consider and weight the evidence they receive very carefully. And I want to pay tribute to the tremendous work that that committee does. I want to build on their reputation and ensure that the SMC is as transparent as possible about its decision-making, and that I've asked the SMC to transition to hold its first public meeting by May 2014. The role of the SMC's Patient and Public Involvement Group will be extended and supported to engage proactively with patient representative organisations, and patient representative groups will also be able to attend SMC meetings and provide evidence, much as they have the ability to do within NICE's process. This increase in the pace and depth of engagement with patients and the public will significantly contribute to the transition towards a wider assessment of value in relation to new medicines. The SMC will also develop processes and protocols to support the attendance at SMC meetings of a representative from the manufacturers of medicines being appraised, in order that they may answer any questions that the committee has on the evidence submitted. In the longer term, the SMC will work with industry partners to establish scoping meetings with manufacturers prior to a submission for a newly licensed medicine. This will ensure that pharmaceutical companies fully understand the SMC submission process and have the best possible chance to submit high-quality evidence to the SMC first time round. Protocols will be developed for implementing a temporary pause in the SMC's appraisal process, which will be instigated where a medicine's cost-effectiveness poses a stumbling block to allowing its acceptance. The pause will facilitate a confidential discussion with the manufacturer through an external negotiator about improving the medicine's cost-effectiveness through either a new or improved patient access scheme. Consideration will also be given to the benefits and challenges of establishing arrangements to carry out external evaluation of medicines where no submission has been instigated by the manufacturer. The Scottish Government currently supports the retention of NHS Board area drug and therapeutic committees as a tool to ensure safe and effective prescribing practices and ownership of the formulary by local clinicians. This would be and will be contingent on a demonstration that NHS Board ADTCs can demonstrate over the next 3 years that they are working well and are ensuring optimal clinical outcomes for their patient population. This is an indication of this government's commitment to the importance of medicines that improve not only people's quality of life on a day-to-day basis, but also medicines that sustain life, or indeed those which improve the quality of end-of-life care. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, this government is committed to pursuing continuously improving high-quality health and care services for the people of Scotland, with a focus on equity and clinical need. I believe the measures I've outlined today will help us secure that vision. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Neil Finlay. 6 minutes, please, or thereby, Mr.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I would very much like to thank the Health and Sport Committee for their report and commend the Chair, Duncan McNeill, on what was an excellent contribution to this debate. The report is a very good one, and it's a very informed contribution to what is a vital debate, and one that has been watched by people, many people in this chamber across Scotland and indeed beyond, because for many of those who have tried to navigate the current system of accessing new treatments, it is at best confusing and at worst downright frustrating and unfair. Defending the IPTR system, the former Health Secretary said, "We have a very fair, rigorous and quick system for appraising NHS drugs in Scotland. The Scottish Medicines Consortium considers whether newly licensed drugs should be used nationwide and recommends them for use where they are proved to be safe, clinically effective and cost-effective. Even where a medicine isn't recommended by the SMC for general use, patients in Scotland can still get it on the NHS if their clinician believes it is appropriate and obtains permission from their local health board." But this simply did not reflect the reality on the ground for many patients, because case after case saw patients with serious conditions such as cancers, MS and other conditions denied access to new generation drugs. And they were often denied access, as the committee report states, despite them submitting clinical and expert evidence as part of their request. High-profile cases emerged as my colleagues Jackie Bailey, Graham Pearson and Jan Lamont and other MSPs representing their constituents raised cases in Parliament. Presiding Officer, the patients involved in these cases did not seek the limelight or public exposure. All they wanted was the chance of an extended life for them or their loved ones. In supporting these brave individuals, we had the campaigning work of those who took the petitions through the public petitions system. They are the people we have to commend for getting us to where we are today. It's their petitions and campaigning that has influenced the committee's inquiry and has indeed forced the government's hand in many ways. They have done this Parliament and the people of Scotland a great service. The committee, in its report, welcomed the previous Swainson and Routledge reviews, but said, and I quote, "They do very little to improve access to new medicines in any meaningful way, and that more fundamental changes were needed." Changes that I believe have to be fair and transparent. Yes, of course they do, but that ultimately have to give greater access to medicines that have not gone through the system. Of course, there's no simple solution. None of us are suggesting that. It's a complex and very sensitive area where answers do not come easy. In the report, the Health and Sport Committee, I think, captured these difficulties very well when they said decisions need to be made about the value of treatments in relation to their effectiveness, cost and wider societal benefits, but within the context of a public sector under increasing budgetary pressures. When these circumstances combine with personal circumstances and experiences of individual patients and their loved ones, and the impact that decisions can have on their length and quality of life, it's probably not surprising that the answers to the questions posed by this are not easily found. A good example of the failings of the existing system was provided in the evidence of Dr Stephen Harrow from the Beatson, who told how he had made an individual patient treatment request which was refused not once but 3 times. This despite being supported by clinical evidence, a situation clinicians, patients and stakeholders found difficult to understand. Presiding Officer, there are always ways of doing things better, and the system has to support patients to get access to the medicines they need when that request for access is supported by clinical judgment and expertise. The report has identified many areas where things could and should be done better, such as improving transparency, patient involvement, collection of data, sharing expertise and standardising paperwork, etc. These steps are all welcome. But the report says that urgent consideration should be given to encourage greater flexibility in the IPTR process to approve drugs where there is clear clinical evidence that a particular patient would derive material benefit from such a drug, even if existing IPTR criteria had not been met fully. I'm pleased that the Scottish Government have accepted the need to improve access and that, in their words, the procedure for accessing drugs in exceptional prescribing circumstances when all other treatments have been exhausted should be clearly linked to clinical opinion. The replacement of the IPTR system with a new peer-approved clinical system is indeed a move in the right direction, but the proof of the pudding will be in how this impacts on patients and whether more people are able to access the life-saving or life-extending drugs that they so desperately need. And summing up, I think the Cabinet Secretary, I would ask him to cover a few questions that we have in response to his own speech, and advise how the new system will be implemented and rolled out. How will it be monitored to ensure that guidelines are not ignored? How does this fund fit with the Statement of Intent on Innovation? How will he avoid the new locally run PAC system becoming another postcode lottery? And I know he said that he wants a national system, but it does say that it will be locally run. And when will he publish the timescale for implementing the new system? Presiding Officer, I know these changes have come very sadly too late for many, but I hope that a new supportive system will help save and extend the lives of many other very needy people.
Many thanks. And now Colin Jackson-Carlow, up to 6 minutes, please, or 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Deputy Presiding Officer, let me welcome today's debate. In so doing, may I also thank Professor Swainston-Rutledge, the Health and Sport Committee and the Cabinet Secretary for the focus and energy that has been brought to this issue in the last year. In a Parliament which has a number of progressive legislative health and care achievements to its collective credit, I make no apology for saying that our inability hitherto to agree an effective route to the access of new medicines for those in need of life support, and in particular, but certainly not exclusively to those suffering from cancer, has been, in my opinion, a stain on the face of devolution. Scottish Conservatives also make no apology for our repeated determination to have this chamber return to the issue. But as we stated when we last tabled a motion for debate earlier this year, we have done so understanding that the political will to establish a cancer drugs fund does not exist in this place, and mindful of this, we have repeatedly offered to work to find an alternative solution, by whatever name, which nonetheless allows Scotland to recover its preeminent reputation in the care of cancer. Because in our view, and that of many clinicians, pharmaceutical companies and others, the existence of a cancer drugs fund in England, and the lack of one here, was notwithstanding the fact that some 34,000 patients had benefit from access to pioneering drugs south of the border, an impediment to current clinical experience and practice, and potentially to future cancer research and development in Scotland. Not just now. That some 3,500 Scots, some inevitably now no longer with us, were unable to access drugs in their home country is a regret I feel very personally. And I know too that there are several on all sides of the chamber who, notwithstanding the battery hen-like utterances that we customarily make, understood that the status quo was not an option, that the Cancer Drugs Fund in England made this progressively impossible. And I pay tribute to their willingness to reach across the political divide, quietly but determinedly, to make progress. They know who they are, and cancer sufferers should be grateful to them. However, without beating about the bush, may I today thank Alec Neil for having the courage, will and determination to pursue a potential solution of which this Parliament can be proud. In its essential ambition, with a significantly higher quality, a properly resourced SMC and with a new ability to negotiate on price and a dynamic clinical trials register, these proposals have within them a package which Scottish Conservatives welcome and will work with him in any way we can to advance and secure. Party politics aside, this is a good day for Mr Neil and his officials, but much more importantly, it is possibly a breakthrough day for the treatment of cancer in Scotland. A lifetime of witnessing the hardest progress in the battle against cancer being fought and won is being rewarded today by a rush of technological breakthroughs. And let us be clear, Scots and Scotland must aspire to offer the very best available. We have an unenviable record of cancer incidence. And while much has been done and should be applauded on the early detection of a range of cancers from breast to bowel and all body points, north and south, and on investment in facilities, that national effort must be backed by the very latest in life-extending and enhancing drug technology. There must be no more of politicians queasily debating whether extra months of life for a young mother or father with skin cancer is worth the price to the public purse. That is what I believe the Cabinet Secretary aspires to achieve, and I applaud him for it. We have worked constructively with him, and we will continue to do so. Yet even still, to borrow Mr Finlay's cliché, the proof will be in the proverbial pudding. And he must ensure that the short time between now and the end of the year is not wasted. And in a constructive spirit, I ask him the following. The Scottish Medicines Consortium has been reluctant to change, and it would be a tragedy if proposals which subsequently emerged did not actually improve access. So will the Cabinet Secretary offer clear direction? We know today that many medicines are not available. Does the Cabinet Secretary envisage that the new medical individual application process will be used for patients who need such medicines now? Will the current catch-22, whereby I want to make progress, where a medicine must be within licence but outside of an SMC restriction, be resolved? How does the Cabinet Secretary anticipate that new systems will catch up with all those medicines currently denied to patients in Scotland? A resubmission process could take a considerable time, given that the SMC may have a workload bulge as a result. How will ministers ensure that patients suffering as we speak do not miss out on new drugs? And the fact that the new PACS system is to be locally run is welcome, but as others have said, it must not be allowed to recreate a system of inequitable patient access across Scotland, as happened before. And can the Cabinet Secretary assure me that the Scottish Government's new guidance will therefore be published and implemented swiftly with health boards, held to account through the strict auditing arrangements that have been promised? Presiding Officer, I have asked deliberately technical and searching questions not to confuse the issue, but because I believe that this week's announcement by the Cabinet Secretary is a genuine and sincere initiative. To succeed, these questions and others need to be considered and answered. A year ago, I asked the Cabinet Secretary to set aside any entrenched position he may have inherited, to use his capacity to reach for, to identify and implement practical solutions, to use his talent in that regard to bring all his energy to bear in cancer. It may be that there is yet much to secure and prove, but in his response to the Health and Sport Committee report, Alec Neil has not been found wanting. So, Deputy Presiding Officer, today, let us agree that while we have not embraced a cancer drugs fund, this Scottish Parliament has embraced the funding of cancer drugs.
Many thanks. And I call on Aileen MacLeod to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm as we move to open debate. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm delighted to be speaking in this important debate as a member of the Parliament's Health and Sport Committee. And I want to begin by acknowledging the cross-party consensus that underpins the Committee's report. There is clearly common ground across all political parties that the issue of access to new medicines is one of the most pressing and most sensitive confronting the NHS. And I therefore hope that we will be able to take forward the report's recommendations in the same spirit of consensus to create a better and more transparent set of criteria for accessing new medicines that will lead to improved outcomes for Scottish patients, and particularly those suffering from rare and very rare medical conditions. And I'd also like to record my thanks to the many expert witnesses, clinicians, the industry, representatives of patient groups and charities, and in particular Breakthrough Breast Cancer, Melanoma UK, Marie Curie Cancer Care and Beating Bowel Cancer, as well as the private individuals who have offered the committee both expert scientific evidence and evidence drawn from their own experiences. And I'm pleased that so many are here today in the public gallery to listen to our debate. And I'd like in particular to welcome the Cabinet Secretary's remarks setting out the Government's response to the Committee's report. These do tackle head-on many of the key issues and recommendations in our report, and I hope that my committee colleagues will also welcome his remarks today as a significant response to our work. Presiding Officer, in the time available, it is not possible for me to cover every aspect of the Committee's report, so I'd like to focus my remarks on a few key areas. Firstly, the commitment to the increased transparency in Scotland's medicines assessment system, mentioned by the Cabinet Secretary, is particularly welcome, as is the additional £1 million investment to support the SMC with its meetings to be held in public from May next year. Great transparency in this process should help to increase patient confidence that the systems used to decide access to medicines are both scientifically sound and fair. And in our report, the Committee made various recommendations seeking a greater involvement by patients and patient representatives in the SMC's work, so I very much welcome the improvements that are to be made through the SMC's Patient and Public Involvement Group in supporting patients to engage in the process. Now, welcome as these changes are, they will only take us so far, and a bigger challenge that was recognised by the committee towards reforming the SMC's actual decision-making process to ensure a better assessment of the cost-effectiveness of medicines and their wider societal impact, in particular for end-of-life care and for treating very rare conditions. Now, this was an issue that the committee called on the Scottish Government and the SMC to review as a matter of priority. And I'm delighted, therefore, the Cabinet Secretary has taken on board this recommendation and that the SMC is expected to conclude its review on establishing a more flexible approach to the evaluation of new medicines and ensure there is a wider assessment of value before Christmas. Now, similarly, I am sure all members of the committee will welcome the proposal to replace the IPTR system with a new peer-approved clinical system that will oversee individual or group requests for SMC not recommended medicines, led by local consultants and linked to clinical opinion. And I'm particularly pleased that the Government has listened to the committee's concerns around the IPTR exceptionality criteria and our calls for the approval of drugs where there is clear clinical evidence that a patient would derive material benefit from a particular drug. And it's also welcome that the NHS will be able to refer new medicines for consideration by the SMC, which have not yet been submitted by a drugs company, where these are considered clinically important to NHS Scotland. And one final point I want to make, Presiding Officer, is around the issue of clinical research trials, which the committee also considered in relation to encouraging greater participation by patients in Scotland where appropriate. And in that respect, I very much welcome the Cabinet Secretary's response for the Government's Chief Scientist's Office to look at the creation of a Scottish clinical trial register, which will hopefully help to raise awareness among patients and clinicians of ongoing trials. Presiding Officer, the report presented by the Health and Sport Committee is a thorough and far-sighted document. It addresses one of the most complex and sensitive matters that anyone involved in public policy is likely to encounter. However, the very nature of the issue makes it equally important that the Government exercises care and performs the very highest level of due diligence at each stage in the process of constructing this new system, and nowhere more so in the development of a revised value-based assessment, where there is a clear opportunity to develop a Scottish model of value. This will take time to achieve, but as the Cabinet Secretary has indicated, this does not mean that the Government cannot act in the meantime, as it has done so through the changes outlined in its response. And I'm delighted that the Rare Conditions Medicine Fund will be extended to 2016, providing an interim measure that should alleviate the dependence on individual patient treatment requests. Now, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I firmly believe that the recommendations made by the committee, which commanded cross-party consensus, together with the Scottish Government's response, do plot a course towards a better and more transparent system for access to new medicines that's based on equity and clinical need in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before I call Malcolm Chisholm, I'd just like to let the Chamber know that there is some time in hand available for interventions. Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Gil Patterson.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to join the petitioners and external organisation in welcoming the announcement that was made yesterday, although as the Beat Bowel Cancer organisation said, the devil is in the detail, and clearly most of that is still to come. But we should certainly pay tribute to those organisations and petitioners for setting this process going. But I think also today we should pay tribute to the committee system of this Parliament, because I think it's been seen at its best in the way that it has engaged with this subject. Clearly, the system had to change, but equally I think we should join the Cabinet Secretary in paying tribute to the SMC, which is has been over the last 12 years a globally respected organisation, and I was privileged in the first years of its existence to be Minister, so obviously I followed it closely at that time, but more recently I've taken an interest, particularly as co-convener of the cross-party group on cancer and co-convener of the cross-party group on rare diseases, because it's those two groups of illnesses that have actually been very much to the fore in recent discussions. Now, I want to concentrate on the Government's announcements, some of the announcements yesterday, but first, two general points. Firstly, it does seem to me that the elephant in the room is value-based pricing. It's not clear to me how it's going to interrelate with the MSC. I'm not sure if it's clear to the Minister or anybody else, but it would be good to hear more about that in the winding up, if that's possible. But certainly, I think we are moving towards an era of more personalised medicine. And I think that's a good news story as well, not just for individual patients who will get more targeted drugs, but also because that, I think, in itself should make a lot of the medicines more cost effective. Now, everybody knows what the problems were, and forgive me if I just concentrate on cancer and rare diseases. As many of the witnesses says, it was difficult to generate a robust cost-effective data for rare diseases, and there has to be a more flexible system there. For cancer, the committee was told that two-thirds of non-cancer drugs were accepted by the SNC, but only a third of cancer. So clearly there were particular problems with cancer drugs, particularly around end-of-life criteria, and we're told that other health technology organisations do have more flexibility around those. So those were clearly key issues that needed to be addressed. And the other big issue, of course, that was very much the focus of attention was the individual patient treatment request. And again, we've heard at the committee, and I've begun to hear at the cross-party group, of the particular problems in terms of rare diseases. The referral criteria are extremely difficult to satisfy, and in fact I'm also told that it's actually quite difficult for those organisations involved with rare diseases to access the new fund, which over the last year, because once again much of that was through the IPTR process. And of course it's well known that the IPTR process was not working for cancer patients. So I very much welcome the government acceptance that the existing cost-effective thresholds are not appropriate for end-of-life medicines or medicines to treat rare diseases. That's possibly the central recommendation coming from the government yesterday, and that was a positive response to a recommendation of the committee, who asked for modification of the qualities in those two situations. So that was absolutely central, what the government announced on that. But the other key announcement yesterday, I think, was about this peer-approved clinical system, where the government is saying they want to link accessing drugs for exceptional prescribing circumstances to clinical opinion. And again, that met the demands, certainly of people involved with rare diseases, I think with cancer and other diseases as well, and again was consistent with the committee recommendation that we couldn't have a system that was just based on exceptionality. So all of that is very positive. I suppose some concerns have been raised about the idea of a national system delivered locally, because in a kind of way the whole system since its inception is supposed to have been a national system delivered locally. And I remember in the first year having to intervene to say, boards, you've got to follow these SMC recommendations. And I think there have been continuing problems and doubts about whether the boards have always been doing that. So two final recommendations that I was interested in. One was that the SMC should engage proactively with patient representative organisations. The Minister, I don't know if he's seen the letter yet, but I wrote to him a week or two ago on behalf of a constituent. I think it was one of the prostate organisations, and there was a revisiting by the SMC to look again at a prostate drug, and he said his organisation and the patient organisations didn't know about it. They would like to have been involved. So I think that recommendation should meet that particular concern. And I notice also that Myeloma UK said that they would like the SMC to explain how they take into account patient group submissions. So that whole area is important. And finally, I was interested at the very end of the government submission that there was no robust evidence to suggest a decline in phase 3 commercial clinical trials, but that does seem to indicate to contradict evidence given by Professor Gourley. I was going to quote it, but I've only got 20 seconds. Column 3826 on the 21st of May, when he said there's absolutely no doubt that a number of examples of clinical studies cannot be done in Scotland because of that factor. And Professor David Cameron, in his written submission, also said that, and he said that to the cross-party group and on cancer and other places as well. There has been a genuine threat to Scotland's great reputation for clinical research, because the standard drugs that were comparators in clinical trials often weren't available to the cancer clinicians in Scotland. So hopefully yesterday's announcement will deal with that problem as well. So it's not just going to benefit patients, which is fundamentally what it's about, but will actually benefit clinical research and the life sciences industry, which is an important part of the Scottish economy.
Thank you very much. I now call Gil Patterson to be followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking Duncan McNeill, the convener of the committee, I think Duncan and his contribution encapsulates what the thinking of the committee and certainly represented the views of the committee extremely well. So thanks for that, Duncan. I'm also pleased to be speaking because I'm a member of the committee itself, so that's an added bonus. Presiding Officer, access to new medicines and the inquiry undertaken by the committee to look into the system presented me with some difficulties in regards to how to provide individuals and families with comfort and satisfy what on the surface would suggest to be an expectation that every drug and treatment on offer should be made available on demand. During the inquiry, we heard stories from individuals who require a particular drug for themselves, from family members who wanted to extend the life of a loved one, or from people who wanted their quality of life to be just that bit better. The fact that, much as I would like and prefer to agree that no matter the cost or the perceived benefit to the individual, there should be no barriers to receiving such help, but we must look at the broader picture. Unfortunately, as much as my empathy for those families and individuals is, I am curtailed in my support by the realisation that tough choices need to be made. And even though the Scottish Government has protected the health budget from Westminster cuts, the prospects of being in a position to provide unlimited funds for every new drug, no matter the cost, is sadly not an option simply because of finite resources. However, when it comes to choices, I very much support the establishment of the £20 million Rare Conditions Medicines Fund, which was welcomed by the committee. This fund helps to improve access to orphan and ultra-orphan drugs, medicines for illnesses that affect fewer than 1 to 2,000 people. This includes categories of cancer, rather than recommending a specific cancer fund. In our deliberations, the committee indeed found little support for the establishment of a separate and exclusive cancer drug fund in Scotland. Although cancer can be and is a devastating illness, the singling out of cancer from all other devastating conditions makes me very uneasy. I suppose my experience when gathering evidence for my members' bill on palliative care in the last term of Parliament coloured my views on this issue, since I found that cancer sufferers had a 90% chance of receiving high-quality palliative care, compared to those with other life-threatening conditions who had a 90% chance of not receiving the same quality of care. A situation that I thought was just wrong. So I am very much in favour of a fund or scheme that is of equal status and effect across illnesses, rather than a preferential or exclusive for one category of illness. Our service should never be partial. Choices also need to be made on where resources should be deployed. If we were to fund all available treatments and drugs, no matter the effectiveness or cost, there is a potential that the ability to provide early treatment that may lead to a cure becoming diminished. My choice is to tackle both early treatment and provision for treatment later on in an illness. Therefore, it should be recognised that for a considerable time, the Scottish Medicines Consortium is world-renowned, which commands global support, has at its heart this very sentiment. However, the Scottish Government is striving to ensure that Scotland's drugs approval systems becomes even more transparent, whilst at the same time increasing access to medicines for end-of-life care and treatment of every rare condition by directing the SMC to apply different and more flexible approaches in the evaluation of medicines in that category. The SMC will have to conclude a review by the end of this year on how to establish this more flexible approach. Also, a new peer approval system to allow clinicians to prescribe medicines that are not accepted by the routine use by the SMC will replace individual patient treatment requests, which will be led by local consultants. The NHS Scotland will be able to refer new medicines for consideration by the SMC, which have not yet been submitted by a pharmaceutical company, where these are considered clinically important to the NHS Scotland, a system that was recommended by the Rutledge review. I believe that the additional measures to the SMC will do two things. Firstly, it will enhance a system that is already highly regarded and build on its undoubted success. Perhaps even more importantly, they will give some comfort to the very families and individuals I mentioned at the start of my contribution. Of course, the changes will increase transparency in the approval process, particularly for patients, as the meetings of the SMC will be held in public, and patients will also be invited to attend peer-review decision-making meetings. An additional investment of £1 million is to be welcomed, and this will be made available to ensure that the work of the SMC becomes more transparent. I am pleased to have been part of the committee that carried out this inquiry and for the opportunity to make recommendations to the Scottish Government on how to move forward. It is pleasing that although we have a system that is envied across the world over, this Parliament and our Government are big enough not to rest on our laurels and brave enough to inquire into a delivery system for new medicines with a view on how we can make it even better. Presiding Officer, I do believe we have achieved our goals. At the same time, that we must always strive for improvement.
Thank you very much. Before I call Ken McIntosh, can I ask members to ensure their mobile devices are switched off unless they're being used to deliver a speech, in which case they should be on silent. Ken McIntosh, to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I want to begin this afternoon with a tale of two constituents, both living less than 2 miles apart in Newton Mearns, both suffering from a very rare blood disease called paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, or PNH, as some members may know it. One of those constituents, Mr. Bill Devine, was denied access to the one drug which could have helped. He contacted me in October 2010, weak and unable to even leave his house other than for blood transfusions. I wrote to the local health board, but the only route to access this drug was through the individual patient treatment request, or IPTR system, and his case was, I quote, not proven. Mr. Devine died in April 2011. The other constituent will be known to some colleagues present here today from our evidence to parliamentary committees. Mrs. Leslie Lolliger was granted access to the same drug that was denied Mr. Devine, and it has transformed her life. She is raising her young family. She is an active member of the local community, and this drug has even allowed her the energy to campaign on behalf of others, petitioning this Parliament to fight for access and fairness for all patients. Across Scotland, across different health conditions and differing health drug treatments, the same story is being played out. Too many families are being denied treatments which their own clinicians recommend for them. Their feelings of dismay and frustration are compounded by the knowledge that others are accessing those very drugs. Now, no one in this Parliament has a monopoly on compassion. I certainly do not wish to portray either the current Health Minister or his predecessor as cold or heartless. But for several years now, we have been told repeatedly that Scotland has a robust system in place and that we would not go down the route of a drugs fund for one particular condition, as has been pursued in England. In his response to the work of the Parliament's Health Committee, the Minister now acknowledges that our system doesn't work. And of course, he has introduced a Scottish Rare Conditions Fund. I simply seek reassurance that the system the Scottish Government now intends to put in place to approve medicines will be effective and that all patients in Scotland will have equitable access to the care they need. At the heart of this issue is how we measure effectiveness. In a cash-limited world, how do we balance clinical effectiveness against cost effectiveness? How do we measure the quality of life? I am encouraged that the Scottish Medicines Consortium, the SMC, is to be asked to broaden its approach, taking into account issues such as the burden of illness and the wider societal impact. For those often very young patients struggling with skin cancer, for example, such an approach holds out the hope that the first new treatments in more than 3 decades will now be available to them. I am pleased too that the SMC is looking at the benefits of a different evaluation of end-of-life treatments. I'm sure none of us underestimate the difficult task facing the SMC in trying to improve on the quality-adjusted life year system, nor of trying to set new approval thresholds. There are a number of recommendations to improve the transparency of the process too, again which will be helpful, if not making a substantive difference to the number of approvals. But let's not make any mistake, as the Health Committee itself put it on page 10 and again page 13 of its report, and I quote, "The challenge is not only to improve transparency and consistency, this time within the IPTR process, but to ensure that the SMC process in the first instance better assesses the cost-effectiveness of medicines." Now, turning to the drugs which have not been approved by the SMC, but which could benefit some patients in some cases, as with the 2 examples I highlighted earlier, the IPTR, or Individual Patient Request System, should at least have been able to offer some hope. But as we all now know, the test of exceptionality, that every case had to be virtually unique, was not only too severe for most patients to pass, it was interpreted differently in different parts of the country. Now, I certainly hope this new clinically led system will mark an improvement, moving away from decisions taken solely on grounds of cost. I understand that the exceptionality test is to be replaced by the criteria when all other treatments have been exhausted, which again gives me hope. The drug treatment for PNH, for example, is expensive, but for the few who need it, the treatment works. It is life transformative, and it doesn't demand an open-ended chequebook from the health service. It only affects up to 2 people in every million of the population. So where are we at the moment? Members may be interested to know that following the last evidence session of the Health and Sport Committee, where the Health Minister said patients would only be turned down if it was believed a drug wouldn't work and no one would be refused solely on grounds of cost, 3 of the patients trying to access treatment for PNH had their applications approved. 2 of them on appeal, one of those initially after being refused just the week before the Minister gave evidence and had that decision reversed. Now, we are here primarily because of patient protest, but also partly because of decisions taken in Europe. As far back as June 2009, the European Council published a recommendation on rare diseases, which included a recommendation for a national plan for rare diseases. If we only manage rare conditions locally, we know from experience that this leads to a lack of specialist knowledge at a local level. It helps create long delays with ongoing bureaucratic, complex referrals, and with local health boards sometimes refusing to share risks and costs, leading to a postcode lottery. Scotland is one of the last countries to comply with the European recommendation on rare disease, which insisted on compliance by the end of 2013 at the very latest. Given this directive, I am still a little concerned by the guidance that the new peer-approved system is to be locally run. Can I also ask the Minister to clarify the Scottish Government's approach to the Fund for Rarer Drugs? For several years, the Government did oppose the Cancer Drugs Fund, and I believe they still do, but we now have the Rarer Drugs Fund. Now, I have constituents with children who have cystic fibrosis, and I'm incredibly pleased and relieved that they have access to the drugs Kalydeco to treat that terrible condition. But none of the other health cases I have dealt with seem to qualify for this fund. Eculizumab, which is used to treat PNH, does not qualify. Ipilimumab, which is used to treat skin cancer, doesn't qualify either. Now, the Rare Conditions Fund, as the Minister has just clarified, has been extended, but only a third of the money has been spent so far. So given that, will the criteria for the fund be extended to cover more conditions until we have the new SMC criteria in place and the new peer-approved clinical system? Presiding Officer, in the end, the test will be whether more patients in Scotland receive treatment currently denied them and whether they do so equitably. Mrs Lolliger told me last night that there was a new PNH patient seen at Monklands just last week, and that she doesn't know whether they will require the drug or not. And she says, and I quote, "I want a proper system in place so I do not have to fight for each patient individually. Please do not think I minded fighting for the patients that got their drug. It just should not come down to someone shouting loudly." Thank you, President.
Thank you very much. I now call Mark MacDonald to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by paying tribute to the petitioners who arrived at the Petitions Committee to raise their concerns in this Parliament. I played quite a unique role in this process in that I was a member of the Petitions Committee at the point at which the petitions were brought to Parliament. I then became a member of the Health and Sport Committee at the point where it was undertaking its inquiry into this. So I've been involved in this from the beginning, if you will, in terms of the parliamentary process, although I missed the writing of the report due to being somewhat engaged in a by-election up in Aberdeen. But the point, I think, is that this is a demonstration of a concern being brought to this Parliament and then being given the serious treatment that it requires. I think I want to look at the issues around rare diseases and orphan conditions following on from the points that Ken McIntosh raised, and it's an issue which I will admit I had familiarity with prior to the petitions coming to Parliament, but I would never have professed to know as much as I've since learned around rare diseases and orphan conditions. I note in the Routledge report the recommendation was made that the SMC should develop a policy specifically relating to ultra-orphan medicines to guide the process of consideration of all available evidence. And I think that's one of the difficulties that has been faced around ultra-orphan medicines, is the fact that because you have a very low patient cohort, not just necessarily within Scotland, sometimes not even necessarily within the UK, but sometimes actually pan-Europe, you're talking about a very, very small number of people. It can be difficult to firstly ensure that there is robust trial data for medicines, but secondly, and most crucially in terms of some of the points that have been raised, around the affordability within QALY of the medicines that are available for these ultra-orphan conditions. And that's why I welcome the further recommendation that was made by Professor Routledge around having a temporary pause in the appraisal process. And I note the Scottish Government has accepted that recommendation, and indeed it was one which the Health Committee itself welcomed. It said, the Health Committee in its report said that such a pause could also create an opportunity for discussion on, for example, whether there was scope to develop a reimbursement rate which could take into account the various factors such as supplying post-licensing data or assessed benefit of medicines post-approval. And to me, the moves in terms of the threshold of QALY and also the moves in terms of the pause in the process, I think, create what could be described as a double lock opportunity, in that they allow for a much wider consideration of medicines which previously would have simply not been considered, but also it allows for further discussion on those medicines which maybe are still not captured by that process, to allow them to be so captured. So I think that is encouraging indeed. I'm sure members will be aware of the All Trials campaign, which has been running for some significant time and which has a number of high-profile supporters, which looks at making sure that the trial data that is made available at the point at which drugs are submitted for approval is as transparent and robust as it can be. And I believe that, as well as looking at the role for the SMC and the role of the decision-making process, there is also a role in this for the pharmaceutical industry and the pharmaceutical companies. And I note comments made by Eric Lowe, Chief Executive of Myeloma UK, who says that he's very encouraged that the SMC will be given additional resources and a revised remit so that they can further build on and evolve their already excellent appraisal processes. But he goes on to say, it's critically important that while improvements to access to medicines are made, we also ensure that we are getting genuine value for money, and that the pharmaceutical industry improves the type and quality of information it provides to get their medicines funded on the NHS. I strongly believe that the SMC are best placed to make this happen. So there's an issue here around pharmaceutical companies fulfilling their role in terms of both transparency, but also in terms of affordability, because we cannot escape the fact that we live in a world of finite resource within the health service, and it is imperative that the drugs companies are willing to come to the table and negotiate around price. And I think that's a point that was reflected in a lot of the evidence that the committee received during its deliberations. In terms of the SMC investment, I think that is very welcome indeed. I think making the SMC process not just more transparent but also more publicly accessible, because it's one thing to publish the findings of the SMC, but to your individual on the street, indeed even to your MSP, there is a lot of the decisions that are published which are very difficult to translate, and making that more publicly accessible and explaining to the public, I think, would be very helpful, because all too often we will read stories of drugs which have not been approved, but we don't always understand or see reflected the reasons that lie behind that. And I think that making that a more publicly accessible would be beneficial. If I could just turn finally, Presiding Officer, the MS Society have raised a number of questions which I'm not sure if the Cabinet Secretary has been made aware of. My colleague George Adam, who obviously has a very strong link to the MS Society, has asked me if I would bring these to the Chamber, and I've agreed to do so. I'll perhaps forward the briefing on to the Cabinet Secretary so he could maybe reply more fully. But they reflect around the timescale for introducing value-based assessment. They reflect around the plans that the Scottish Government has to involve stakeholders in developing the reforms, and I think that is perhaps the crux of their concern, and I suspect would be the crux of the concern of many other organisations, would be around how can stakeholder organisations feed into the reform process and feel that they are being fully involved as well. Because I think one of the points that has been raised repeatedly is that as well as making it more transparent, more open, we want to ensure that those organisations, those individuals who have a concern or have an interest would want to feed their views in to ensure that they were taken into account. So perhaps the Cabinet Secretary would take a moment in his closing remarks to reflect on that. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call Christine Graham to be followed by Nanette Milne.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome, like others, the reforms announced, but in particular I do welcome the tone of this debate. Others have mentioned the 20 million that will continue in the rare conditions medicines, that the SMC is to be more transparent and flexible in approach, holding its meetings in public and so on. But I want to focus in particular on the demise of the IPTR process to the peer approval system. And I think that it's incumbent on the Cabinet Secretary that would corner him today, but to give some more deadlines and timescales to that, because time is of the essence for people listening to this debate. I welcome a more effective approach to the critical test for authorising drugs to be given when they're not readily available on the NHS, moving away from, others have mentioned, as Ken McIntosh did, the postcode lottery of IPTR. The process difficulties that are for people, there will be advocacy in the new system. The test of exceptional circumstances, which is almost impossible to meet, to what I believe and I hope will be more of material benefit on a person-centred approach to any application for drugs, out with the usual. I think this debate, Deputy Presiding Officer, shows this Parliament at its thoughtful, compassionate and responsible best. But we have not shared our critical faculties, ensuring, as rightly members across the Chamber, and ensuring that what the Government has announced actually happens. We owe it to all the people outside. The Health Committee, I have to say to Duncan McNeill, was an excellent report. I'm glad I came into the debate because I read it from cover to cover. It was very sound. It had hard things to tackle. This is a very sensitive area and you didn't shy away from it, and the report was, more importantly, unanimous. The Petitions Committee, Dave Stewart here, Petitions Committee started out here more as a meet and greet. It now actually is substance and get things done in here. It got the Borders Railway, it's got this coming, it really has arrived, and I think other parliaments should look to what it achieves for the people, bypassing the politicians, making them pay attention. I think the Cabinet Secretary too. I think you're a man, I'm not looking for a promotion, you're a man who gets things done. You're into the job, you're doing things, but we'll find out if you complete the report card. But most of all, I congratulate the constituents that we all have, who've all turned up at our surgeries, who've been looking for IPTRs and have had to struggle against the system. And I talk about my own constituent, who won't mind me mentioning him because he's been mentioned here before, Ian Morrison. What he did was he tried everything through himself, he tried everything on his own. Like others, he trawled the internet, he trawled the websites. He had to go on a very steep learning curve. He went to politicians across the spectrum. I don't blame him. Who wouldn't? And he had to find out how to deal with it. His application was at first rejected. It was then reviewed successfully. He eventually, having been diagnosed with bowel cancer 2 years ago, accessed Cetuximab. Where is he today? Well, his wife's in the gallery. He's in the shop, minding the shop. But he had to go about it the hard way. He had to go to websites, find out voluntary organisations, go to every politician he could think of, and so on. And what he's doing now, of course, is directing other people in the same situation to politicians and others who might help. And, of course, it shouldn't be like that, and we all know that. So I thought, well done, Ian Morrison, that's it. But then on Friday, walked into my surgery, a man of 40-odd, baby in the carrier, 3 months old, toddler at home, wife with him, a wee bit of chat, thought it was just one of those ordinary meetings. What's happening? Diagnosed with bowel cancer, 1st of August this year. His life turned around. From an ordinary life, building houses, he's now scanning the internet and websites. He's coming to me, he's going to everybody, trying to find out what he can have on the system. And what struck me was that his surgeon, his consultant, didn't tell him of IPTRs, didn't tell him anything about that. He's now fighting the system to try and get second opinions, to see what's available to him, and so on. And that's what would happen to all of us, and it shouldn't be like that. So I very much welcome this change, and the change in the culture, so that people who suddenly have this landing on them from out of the blue find something in place that is helpful, accessible, fair, just and open. It won't mean that everybody will get everything they want, we know that, but at least it will be for the right reasons and will be the same across Scotland. So what I want to hear from the Cabinet Secretary in the summing up is what will happen to those people between now and when the new system is in place. Because every week, every month counts, and you know that and I know that. So what we need to know in the transition is, will that culture, will that way of looking at applications under the new system now be applied to IPTRs? Will we find it being individually centred? Will we find the test being material benefit, not exceptional circumstances? If that starts from the minute we walk out of here, then this Parliament will have achieved something.
Many thanks. I now call Nanette Millen to be followed by Richard Lyle.
Presiding Officer, we live in a time when increasingly new drugs are coming on stream which can prolong the lives of patients with metastatic cancer and other terminal conditions and enhance their quality of life so that they can enjoy precious additional time with their nearest and dearest. But these new drugs tend to be expensive and may not be approved for use by the NHS because the appraisal process doesn't find them to be cost-effective. So patients who might benefit from them either have to pay for them themselves or appeal to their health board to consider their case for treatment. I first became aware of the difficulties encountered by these patients in 2008, when the late Mike Gray, a victim of advanced bowel cancer, brought his experiences of the then exceptional prescribing procedure to the notice of the Public Petitions Committee, because he wanted to spare future patients from what he had gone through in his efforts to be prescribed Cetuximab by NHS Grampian. Sadly, Mike Gray died whilst his petition was still being considered, but his widow, Tina McGeever, continued his work, which resulted in new Scottish Government guidelines and the introduction of the IPTR, or Individual Patient Treatment Request process. This new system, of course, still relied on proving exceptionality from the general population of sufferers from a disease or condition, and therefore further petitions were brought to Parliament by representatives of patients with rare and orphan diseases who were still unable to access appropriate treatment. Moreover, the IPTR, as we've heard, was not resulting in easier access to new medicines for terminal cancer patients. Hence the inquiry by the Health and Sport Committee, because all of its members, including myself, felt strongly that a better way had to be found for patients to access medicines which are clinically justified, even if they're not recommended for NHS use, because they haven't been assessed by the Scottish Medicines Consortium as cost-effective. Until a better value-based system can be devised, my party, and particularly my colleague Jackson Carlaw, has campaigned for a Cancer Drugs Fund in Scotland to replicate that set up in England 3 years ago. And while some patients are now benefiting from the Rare Diseases Fund initiated by the Cabinet Secretary, it is a matter of regret to us that over 3,000 cancer patients in Scotland have already missed out on accessing the drugs that would have been available to them had such a fund been in place here. And concerns have been raised with us by clinical academics that there's a very real risk that we'll lose our place at the cutting edge of research because new generation drugs are assessed against current state-of-the-art products. The knock-on effect for Scottish patients being that they may not receive still newer drugs being trialled against those currently not recommended to the NHS in Scotland, and for clinical research, a very significant negative impact. I hope the creation of a dynamic Scottish Clinical Trials Register will allow Scotland's involvement in such research to be accurately monitored in future, because it's crucially important not only to patients, but to an economy which is heavily dependent on our good reputation in life sciences. However, we are now moving on, and the Government's response to the Health and Sports Committee's recommendations gives us hope that cancer patients in Scotland will soon have access to new drugs when these are justified on clinical grounds, via what hopefully will be a robust and sustainable procedure, both for the appraisal of new drugs and for their prescription to NHS patients based on expert clinical judgment. It became clear to the committee that two main issues had to be tackled: the appraisal process undertaken by the SMC and the need to reform the IPTR process. And so the Rutledge and Swainson reviews were therefore very welcome. As others have said this afternoon, the SMC has gained international respect for its work over the last 12 years in evaluating the clinical and cost-effectiveness of all new licensed medicines presented to it by the pharma industry relative to other available drugs, and then deciding whether they should be recommended for use in the NHS in Scotland. The SMC's yardstick, as we know, is the cost per quality adjusted life year, the QALY, when considering a drug's cost effectiveness. But when this is relatively high, it may use modifiers to allow flexibility in its decision making. And whilst this generally works well, the committee considered that existing assessments aren't always appropriate for medicines for use at the end of life or to treat rare diseases. So the Government's determination to take action on this by instructing the SMC to review its procedures to allow for greater flexibility when evaluating these drugs is good news, and I have no doubt the SMC will welcome the opportunity to do this. There is a degree of urgency about it, of course, and I am pleased that we will hear the SMC's proposals by the end of the year. The committee also agreed with the Rutledge review that the system of SMC appraisal could be more transparent and publicly available, and for me, the allocation of £1 million annually to support the SMC in achieving this is also welcome. The proposed replacement of the increasingly discredited IPTR system with a peer-approved clinical system has been widely welcomed by the groups who gave evidence to the committee, because this should enable patients to access such drugs when these are recommended on clinical grounds by experts in the field who will be called on to give their judgment. But I would like reassurance from the Cabinet Secretary that he does anticipate increasing numbers of patients at last being able to access new medicines, and that he will ensure that funding of NHS boards in Scotland will not be a barrier to achieving this. Presiding Officer, there is a limit to what I can comment on in 6 minutes, but the Scottish Government has responded positively to most of the recommendations in the Health and Sport Committee's report. Scottish Conservatives have appreciated the opportunity to contribute to the Rutledge and Swainson reviews and to present our views to the Cabinet Secretary, and we welcome his consensual approach to such an important and sensitive issue. We still have to learn more of the all-important detail, but I do think at last we are seeing progress on widening access to new medicines as a result of some painstaking work by both the committee and by the Scottish Government. However, I would ask the Cabinet Secretary at the end of the debate to commit to reporting on progress to the Health and Sport Committee within 6 months of the new systems being set up. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call Richard Lyle to be followed by David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Health and Sport Committee, I am also happy to take part in this debate today. The debate today on this issue is clearly something of great importance to the people of Scotland, and I note the different petitions which were lodged with the Petitions Committee here in this Parliament. In response to the petitions, the Health and Sport Committee placed priority on exploring this issue at hand, and I wish to place on record along with my colleagues, the good work done by the convener Duncan McNeill, the witnesses who came into the inquiry, the cancer groups and the staff of the committee who helped to move this inquiry along. The committee's ambition, which I am sure is shared by all parties in the chamber, is to improve access within the NHS in Scotland to newly licensed medicines that provide the best outcomes for patients and enable them to lead a healthy life, as healthy a life as possible. I am pleased to say that the proposed changes by the Scottish Government have been made with this ambition in mind, and developed with the recommendations of the Health and Sport Committee in consultation with stakeholders. I am also pleased to welcome the £20 million fund designed to cover the cost of medicines for patients with very rare conditions that already has been introduced due to the interim recommendation from Professor Charles Swainson and Rutledge. This fund, initially intended to run until April 2014, as already has been explained, has been extended to 2016. And the extra £20 million, as the Cabinet Secretary said earlier, each year in funding will help improve access to orphan drugs, medicines for illnesses that affect fewer than 1 in 2,000 people, that have not been recommended for routine use by the SMC Scottish Medical Consortium. I am pleased to say that as of the 5th of May 2013, 71 patients in Scotland benefit from the new funding. Of these 71 patients, 24 are below the age of 6 and 16. The Scottish Medical Consortium is already an effective and comprehensive organisation due to their timelessness in providing advice to NHS boards in Scotland concerning the status of all newly licensed medicines. It is my hope that when the recommendations from the committee are put in place, the Scottish Medical Consortium will become more transparent and increase access to medicines for end-of-life care, as well as treating very rare conditions. I am pleased to say that the Health Secretary has directed the Scottish Medical Consortium to apply a more flexible approach in the evaluation of medicines for end-of-life care, as well as complete a review on the matter by the end of this year, which will hopefully address how to implement a more flexible approach in the new year. The aim is to ensure that this process is done as quickly as possible, whilst maintaining attention to detail. The quick implementation of the new recommendations will help to make the process of medical approval more transparent for patients, as the Scottish Medical Consortium will now be held in public. Patients will be invited to attend peer review decision-making meetings. On top of this, the further £1 million, which will be invested to help increase the transparency of the work carried out by the Scottish Medical Consortium. I think it is right that we continually examine all aspects of our health service. There is always room for improvement. However, I think that the Scottish Medical Consortium should also be commended, as it is globally respected and, as I said earlier, has the fastest and most efficient medicine review process in the UK. During the evidence session for the Health and Sport Committee back in December, there was broad support for the Scottish Medical Consortium, and obviously it's very difficult work that it does. There was great support of the timescale that the SMC has for producing guidance on new drugs. On average, their assessment per drug is completed in 7.4 months, compared with 21.4 months for NICE in England. This is done without any sacrifice being made in the rigour of their methods. Can I say in closing, Presiding Officer, that I have been asked to highlight a case, as many members have highlighted today, cases within their own areas. Earlier in the week, I was contacted by a constituent, and I have her permission to name her, Miss Geraldine Ward, who is in need of a drug, Fampra, which helps sufferers of MS to walk. This drug is not being presently prescribed by NHS Lanarkshire Health Board, and I hope that new recommendations, when they come into force, will help Miss Ward get the medicine she requires to improve the quality of life. As already has been said by Christine Graham, we have to help our constituents where possible. I intend to highlight this brave lady's case to NHS Lanarkshire and intend to pursue my constituents' case to resolve. I commend and compliment the Cabinet Secretary, Alec Neil, on his commitment to the NHS in Scotland, to his quick work in regards to this inquiry and to his action in this matter. Thank you.
Many thanks, and I now call David Stewart to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I would also like to congratulate Duncan McNeill and the Health and Sport Committee on their excellent report, and also to commend the Rutledge and Swainson reviews, which have made a helpful contribution to this debate. Presiding Officer, I'd like to focus my remarks on patients' access to medicines for orphan diseases, which were highlighted by the 3 petitions which were the springboard for this committee report. And as convener of the Public Petitions Committee, as members have identified earlier, I took evidence along with my colleagues from a variety of groups such as Rare Disease UK. And I'd like to identify myself with Annette Milne's comments about the great work that Tina McKeever from Murray did in terms of drugs. I would like to thank Christine Graham for her very kind remarks about the work of the Public Petitions Committee. So, Presiding Officer, first of all, what do I mean by orphan medicines? Well, that is, of course, treatment of life-threatening conditions affecting no more than 5 in 10,000 people, while ultra-orphan medication is licensed for treatment for diseases with prevalence of less than 1 in 50,000. During evidence to my committee, Presiding Officer, Alistair Kent of Rare Disease UK, and I quote, "People with rare diseases do not choose to have a rare disease. There is no kudos attached to having something that is difficult to diagnose, expensive to treat, and about which little might be known." Mr Kent, as others have done, have praised the European Union's orphan medicine products policy that has led to therapies being produced for diseases that have been untreatable and which have led to consistent and chronic ill health. And of course, market access to new drugs is one dimension, but direct access to individual patients is another. However, I would say to the Cabinet Secretary that I do welcome the Scottish Government's £20 million per year Rare Conditions Medicines Fund, which should provide access for patients suffering orphan and ultra-orphan conditions to medicines not approved by the Scottish Medicines Consortium. As we've heard, initially it was 2013. I think the Cabinet Secretary said it's now 2016. And could perhaps the Cabinet Secretary in his wind-up tell me whether he's confident that the value-based pricing will be in place when the fund comes to the end? And will the peer-approved clinical system take over from the individual patient's treatment request scheme, and at what timescale? Now, Presiding Officer, many treatments for orphan conditions make a tiny physical difference to the patient, but a massive change to quality of life. Can I perhaps give one example that, again, Mr Kent quoted to my committee? He described the story of a young woman who is an inborn error of metabolism. Now, by having enzyme replacement therapy, her lung function went up by 4%, which you may think isn't a lot, and be right. That's enough for a short intake of breath for a healthy person, or perhaps a longer intake of breath for someone doing a speech. But for her, this means she comes off artificial respiration for most of the day, a huge improvement in her quality of life. So can you imagine the frustration of families when they see a new therapy but can't access it, even when their own clinicians have recommended it? Now, we've heard, Presiding Officer, that health economics plays a huge role in this debate. And again, we've heard a lot about the SMC. I heard it described on the radio just the other morning as a group of hard-headed economists and statisticians who have the assessment tool, the QALY, which we've heard a lot about, the Quality Adjusted Life Year, as their second language. But many of the treatments for rare diseases come above the 30,000 per quality limit because they're novel therapies at the cutting edge of innovative research and development. Now, NICE, the...
Bob Doris.
I thank the member for giving away. It's just a kind of a point of information. Perhaps you were going to address it anyway, Mr Stewart. There are difficulties with the thresholds and modifiers applied, as you're about to highlight, I'm sure, but the £30,000 threshold is not an automatic cut-off, and medicines do get approved at a far higher level than that. Perhaps not enough, though, and I think I would accept that point.
David Stewart,
yes, the member is quite right about modifiers, and he's quite right about the point he makes. I was just going to touch on that particular point. NICE, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, of Health and Clinical Excellence, looked at developing the quality system to ultra-orphan conditions, but they ruled it out because it requires such a high level of assumptions, which would leave no confidence in the outcome of the process. So how many people are affected by rare diseases? Well, I was shocked to find there's over 6,000 rare diseases affecting 1 in 17 people, and that's around 300,000 people in Scotland. But Stephen Nutt, who gave evidence to the Health and Sport Committee in March on rare diseases, said, "We do not think," and I quote, "we do not think that patients in Scotland currently have fair access to treatment." But the key point that he stressed was that patients sought equity, not preferential access to treatment. And we've heard from Ken McIntosh earlier about the PNH Alliance, who represent another orphan condition, the ultra-rare bone marrow disease. The key drug, which Ken McIntosh talked about, Ecomembag, which can change life expectancy from normal to a medium survival rate of 10 years. Leslie Lodger from PNH Scotland told the Health and Sport Committee last year, and I quote, "In my health board area, 5 patients have been recommended for the drug. Of the 5 have been granted funding, but the other 4 have not been so fortunate. One gentleman was refused funding several times. When I spoke to him, he told me all he wanted was a life. Sadly, he died the next day. In closing, Presiding Officer, could I draw members' attention to sub-orphan diseases, such as underactive thyroid, which affects 15 in every 1,000 women in the UK. My committee is currently looking at a petition on this thyroid issue. There is one recommended medicine. The other options are not licensed or do enough research to establish the long-term safety of the medicine. And finally, could the Cabinet Secretary raise a couple of concerns that Scotland is in danger, as we've heard from Malcolm Chisholm, of losing its position at the forefront of clinical research. In particular, Scotland is going down the league table for provision of large-scale Phase 3 commercial trials. The Minister will know well that these trials are crucial for the scientific communities and, of course, of patients who are being trialled. So this debate has been a useful reminder of the often forgotten sufferers of orphan diseases, who feel they are the Cinderellas of the health service. I welcome the Scottish Government's initiative to set up the New Rare Conditions Fund, but careful evaluation is needed over the 3 years of the fund's life to ensure it works for those who are suffering the most. Thank you.
Many thanks. Before I call Willie Coffey, can I just remind the Chamber that after Willie Coffey we'll be moving to closing speeches, and I would expect all members who participated in this debate to return to the Chamber for closing speeches. Willie Coffey.
Presiding Officer, thank you very much. In over 20 years as an elected member and trying to help with a huge variety of issues for local people, I think I can say that this issue proved to be the most challenging, frustrating and heartbreaking of them all. When Janice and Alan Glasswell first came to see me at my surgery in Darvel, I had no idea of the battles that they were facing. Janice facing her battle with cancer, but the family faced another battle with the system to try and get treatment they hoped would help. It was a battle to get basic information, to get explanations, to meet the people at the centre of the case, and to ultimately understand the reasons why the system rejected Mrs Glasswell's application for the drug cetuximab. Even after she sadly died, and despite my best efforts, I still could not understand why a person who opinion suggested might benefit from the drug was still refused the drug. None of us could understand the criteria that applied in the IPTR process. Nobody explained it, and the appeal did nothing to alter the outcome. There was clear clinical opinion in favour of giving the treatment, but this wasn't enough. I still don't know why, and I suspect to this day Alan Glasswell doesn't know either. Many of the issues that made matters worse weren't even clinical issues. They were about communication, getting simple explanations, being allowed to meet people, feeling that the system was trying to help rather than hinder. The family became medical research experts, looking for comparable cases to help their argument, and they did so. They shouldn't have had to do any of this, and so much of the family's remaining precious time together was taken up with this activity. So I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for personally meeting with Mr and Mrs Glasswell during her illness, for listening to their story and taking the action that I hope, and many people will hope, will go a long way to making sure that families don't have to face circumstances like these again. At the time of their lives when they are at their weakest and when they needed most help. The IPTR process is to go and will be replaced by a new system which is clinically driven, will consider those medicines not yet approved by the SMC, and will put the patients at the heart of the process, involving them in matters that affect their own health. The decision whether to grant a medicine will now be taken by clinicians who agree that benefit can derive from it, rather than having to prove exceptionality as we have at present. The family found that perhaps the most tortuous part of the experience, knowing that one clinician thought the drug could help, but then to be demoralised by refusal on the basis of something called exceptionality. One crucial element of any new system is this thing called timeliness, the need to conduct reviews and come to decisions as quickly as possible. The review by the SMC, to be completed by Christmas, will, as I understand it, look at the cost-effectiveness issue and what kinds of cost thresholds or qualities should be in place. This value-based pricing policy, which appears to have been dropped by the UK, who had overall reserved powers in this matter. So, as the committee again recommends, whatever we do with the qualities, we have to make sure that we don't simply apply the same criteria that ends up with the same outcome and disregards clinical benefit. The Health Committee report and witness evidence covered this issue, and I'm really pleased that the Scottish Government is introducing a range of measures to make all of these improvements. Members have mentioned the £20 million Rare Conditions Medicine Fund, which is being extended to 2016, is going to help many people who are suffering from cancer and other diseases where the medicines are not yet approved. And the Cabinet Secretary has acted very positively to address these difficult situations. When we do introduce any new system, it's important that it is transparent and can be held to account for the decisions made. That was one of the main difficulties also reported to me, an apparent lack of accountability. I'm hoping, therefore, that the additional £1 million mentioned being made available to assist with the process of transparency will in some way involve Health Improvement Scotland as part of their wider audit role, as well as the purpose of keeping patients in the loop. In concluding my remarks, Presiding Officer, healthcare, as we know, doesn't come cheap. At nearly £12 billion, this represents about a third of the entire Scottish Parliament budget, aimed at supporting our National Health Service in Scotland. It's a service we're proud of and are determined to maintain and improve. Ultimately, a new system for providing access to new medicines will still lead to yeses, but will sadly still lead to some noes. The crucial element that has been missing until now is that families like the Glasswells had lost confidence in the previous system, and they had to fight on another front that they shouldn't have had to do. We now have the chance to restore that confidence, and I think we owe a debt of gratitude to our Cabinet Secretary, Alec Neil, for not only listening with sympathy and understanding to the plight of many families, but for acting when he was asked to do so. And I think he deserves our full support to make this new process one that we can all be proud of. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we now turn to the closing speeches. And firstly, I call on Jackson Carlaw with up to 7 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by congratulating Duncan McNeill on the way in which he moved the motion, and also, I think, as others have done, for the way in which he has convened the Health and Sport Committee and managed the whole process of the evidence we've heard. As he said this afternoon, the official report may have been getting a little bit lost in the acronyms. As he said, they will be bedazzled, bewitched and bewildered by all the various acronyms. And in fact, at one point, I wasn't sure that Duncan McNeill didn't drop in ACDC as well in relation to all the acronyms that were being deployed. But it did illustrate, I think, that it is a complicated subject. But I say that because this is a very serious subject we've discussed this afternoon. And whilst, as so many, I think, of the members have said, there is a lot of detail, I don't think we need to be po-faced. I hope I'm not being unnaturally celebratory about the whole thing, but I actually do approach this afternoon's debate on this report and everything that has happened as something about which I'm not a cockeyed optimist, I'm a cold-eyed optimist. There's a lot of detail to be developed and to be established. But I think today is a landmark day. I hope it is. And the sense underpinning the very many questions that I think came from members all across the chamber, the thing you have to ask in considering all those questions is, are these questions that are being posed out of a suspicion that there may not be an end result arising from everything that has been announced today? Or are we asking these questions because we believe there is a determination to arrive at an end result out of our debate today? And it's the latter, I think, that we can have a confidence in. And that is why, although he still has to get out the door at the end of this afternoon's debate, and perhaps One aide, when I was having a coffee there, texted me to say, "You've been far too kind to the Cabinet Secretary, yuck." That has been ladled on, I think, by others in the Chamber. And it's a wide door, but I hope that the Cabinet Secretary can still make his way through it. Mr Finlay is going to remind me of that fact, I think.
Neil Finlay.
I think probably one of the lessons from today is that where people at the grassroots are telling us there's a problem with a system or a policy, then we are duty-bound to listen and correct the problems that exist with that system or policy.
Jackson Carlo.
And I very much agree with that. And Mr Finlay was one, as was Malcolm Chisholm, as was Christine Graham, as were several other members who pointed out that this whole process began with petitioners who raised the issue for us, and from there, I think, we got a far better understanding of the reality of what was happened, and as politicians had to confront that truth. Mr MacDonald said, in fact, that he was unique, but Lynette Milne was bristling with impatience at that point, having also been on the Petitions Committee and the Health Committee when these matters were being discussed. So, whilst his experience may not be unique, let us agree that Mr MacDonald is. and leave it at that. There were two areas that I thought, speeches I particularly liked. I was very impressed with the very personalised speech that I thought Ken McIntosh gave in detailing the very practical experience that individuals had faced. And I think this really spoke to the points I've tried to raise, that we are living in an era of rapidly advancing technology, and we have to be able to respond quickly to that. And I think that, we mustn't forget that every sufferer is an individual. And he spoke about ipilimumab. And the effectiveness of the new PAC system will be determined whether it improves patient access to innovative new treatments. An early test of the system may well be provided by whether patients are able to access a new drug for melanoma, ipilimumab, which is expected to receive a European licence next month for first-line treatment of patients with melanoma, the drug being already approved by the SMC for the treatment of patients with second-line setting. Now, when it first received a licence in 2011 for patients who already received therapy, it represented the first treatment advance in this disease in 30 years. And several of us in this Parliament attended an excellent briefing where we met relations of those who had suffered and died of this particular cancer, and who had an extraordinary end-of-life improvement as a result of access to it through trials elsewhere. Indeed, some are actually still surviving way past the original expectations on this drug. Yet, despite it, all 30 IPTR applications for the drug that were made by clinicians were turned down. And we must not see history repeat itself over the coming months. And I thought Christine Graham, in a sense, in talking about the IPTR process, and the fact that some constituents were not told about it, the truth is that I think some clinicians and GPs lost faith in the process, and indeed some would argue that they were told not to bother making an application because a determination had already been made and there wasn't any point. And that is actually, I think, again, what has to be overcome. And she asked questions similar to those that I did too, that it's important that we know what's going to happen in the here and now between today and the end of the year to ensure that people don't find themselves, with all the positive stuff that we've had to discuss today, being left somewhere in the wash. Presiding officer, you've given me an extra minute, which I wasn't anticipating. But I simply want to conclude, I think, by saying this. I wasn't trying to be ladle on the applause earlier on unduly or unnecessarily. I think for Scottish Conservatives, this has been something that we felt terribly important and also very passionately about. We recognise, and Christine Graham was keen to nobble me on the way out of the chamber earlier, that there wasn't support for a cancer drugs fund in this chamber, or in fact from those who gave evidence to the committee. We still believe, though, that the existence of a cancer drugs fund in England meant that we couldn't carry on in Scotland without making a qualitative step forward. The qualitative step forward that the Cabinet Secretary has outlined is full of promise. I believe, as I said earlier, that this is not an announcement today designed to create a smokescreen from which genuine progress will not emerge. I believe today that Parliament, in supporting, as I believe we will, the Cabinet Secretary, is empowering him to make sure that what he has announced today, sooner rather than later, becomes a reality.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Rhoda Grant, who also has 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I, like many others who have spoken today, want to welcome the committee report and also the government's response to it. But as many have said, the credit for these changes actually go to the petitioners who petitioned this Parliament on the subject, and also to the very many people who lobbied their MSPs and had the bravery to fight for others while their own lives were ending. And Nanette Milne and David Stewart paid particular tribute to Mike Gray and Tina McGreever, who actually started this campaign 5 years ago, a campaign that's been taken up by so many. But if what Duncan McNeill said in his speech, that 3 months is a lifetime to many of the people looking for those drugs, then it can only tell you how many lifetimes have passed in the last 5 years since we started discussing this and looking for solutions to the problem. Decisions on access to medicines need to have empathy and compassion at their core and be based firmly on clinical judgment and effectiveness. A system that depends on people's ability to pay flies in the face of an NHS free at the point of use. A system that depends on people being able to make the case for their treatment is also equally wrong. Everyone, regardless of their wealth or their ability to make their case, must be treated the same, and we must have a system that's fair and transparent that we can all sign up to. And while I welcome, like many others, again the Cabinet Secretary's announcement, the devil is in the detail, as many people have said, and I look forward to getting more information when it comes to hand. The test will, of course, be that there are more yeses, as Malcolm Chisholm said, but they have to be based on clinical assessment, with the patient at the centre of that decision-making. Much of the discussion today has surrounded access to cancer treatments, and I think this is mainly because it's a field where there are rapid changes to medication. But Malcolm Chisholm mentioned in his speech today that treatments are becoming more and more individualised, where we can tell which medicines will actually be of benefit to individual people depending on their DNA. And that means that the choices we face maybe are not so tough, because clinicians can really burrow down into who those treatments will be effective for, who they will benefit. So it's not a case of making very expensive drugs available to everyone on a hit-and-miss basis. We can actually choose the people that those will be effective for and make them available. But in order to do this, we need to be able to test the effectiveness of those drugs on tumours, and that work is only carried out now where there is a recognised SMC-approved drug treatment regime. If tumours are not tested against all available medicines, then clinicians won't have the opportunity to look at alternative drug treatments, or indeed apply under the IPTR system. And I think it was the Cabinet Secretary said that 40% of applicants are turned down, but we don't really know the figure of those who apply, because maybe they don't have the information to talk about the efficacy of the treatment, because that has not been carried out. But also, as others have said, because they know that other applications have been made and failed. So we need to look at a fairer way of doing that. We can't obviously have this debate by focusing only on cancer treatments. I think that would be a disservice to many people out there who have life-threatening conditions. And we've seen in the past many life-threatening conditions that are now termed as treatable chronic diseases because of medical intervention. And we need, as Gil Patterson, I think, said, to make sure that we don't have two-tier access to treatments, because those with cancer going ahead of those with other conditions. So I think we need to have a system that works for all treatments and diagnoses that are there. Many people spoke about the cost of drugs for orphan and ultra-orphan diseases, and they can be hugely expensive. And it's because there is very limited use for these medicines because of the rareness of the illnesses they actually impact. We maybe need a different funding formula that reflects this and makes sure that those that suffer from those very rare diseases are not discriminated against. And Malcolm Chisholm made the point that the fund was very difficult to access, and I would hope that maybe the Cabinet Secretary would look at improving how people access the fund in the short term, because the 20 million per annum is very welcome. But as he said himself, only £6.5 million was drawn down from that this year, and it seems to indicate that there is maybe a gap in how people can access it. And I think Dave Stewart also mentioned in his speech that the quality system really doesn't work with rare diseases. So maybe a quick review of the system to see how we can improve it in the short term until we come up with a more a long-lasting system that meets all conditions. There are also changes in medicines available for chronic diseases. Arthritis, for example, can be totally debilitating and have an enormous effect on a person's life and well-being and their independence. And in these cases, we not only have to weigh the cost of the treatment against the value to the patient, but also the value to society, because I spoke to somebody who was looking for a treatment for arthritis. That would have kept her independent, kept her at work, stopped her being a burden, as she would have seen it, to society by needing full-term care and being dependent on benefits for the rest of her life. But that cost didn't seem to be taken into account when making the decision about whether or not she could access to that drug. So I think that is really important as well, as is availability of drugs. And it's also, this is an issue where the recognised drug treatments don't always work for everybody, and there is lesser known treatments out there, but because they are not fully recognised, sometimes they can be difficult to persuade clinicians to use them, and when the clinicians are persuaded, supplies are not readily available. So all those issues need to be looked at in the round. Presiding officer, a number of people mentioned access to drug trials. I think Malcolm Chisholm and Nanette Milne were among those, and actually talked about, because we lag behind in drug treatments at the moment, then we are not seen as a preferred site for drug trials, because we can't compare the new data with the most up-to-date data on treatments available. So I think that's something we need to look at and make sure that it doesn't become a problem. I'm seeing my time's running out, Presiding Officer, but I really welcome this debate, and I hope it will lead to a system where we don't have to pay, we don't have to lobby to get the treatment we need, and we look forward to seeing the detail of these proposals in time.
Many thanks. I now call on Alex Neil, Cabinet Secretary. I can give you up to 9 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by thanking every member who has taken part in this debate. I think it's shown the Parliament very much at its best in responding to the needs of the people. We should remind ourselves that these are not whisky bottles on the windows. The whole concept is this is the people looking in their Parliament to see if we are responding to their needs, and we've done that, I think, this afternoon. Can I particularly thank those who mentioned myself, particularly Jackson Carlo, who was extremely kind indeed. But let me say that I have an absolutely first-class team in St Andrews House, some of whom are actually sitting here in the Civil Service Gallery today, and without them we wouldn't be where we are today. Can I say that one of the key themes running through the debate from all sides of the chamber has been the need to spell out the detail much more. So let me make two pledges to the Parliament. Three pledges really. Firstly, in the time I have allotted, which is also an extra minute, I will try to answer as many of the questions posed by members during the debate as I possibly can. But I'm not going to be able to answer all the questions, because we would be here until about 7 o'clock tonight if I was able to do that. So those questions that I'm not able to answer, or indeed including the ones that I'm going to answer in the chamber, we will go through the verbatim report tomorrow morning, and we will look at all the questions that have been posed by members, and we will place responses in SPICE next week in one document that can be accessed by members, so that you can see the answers to the questions that we can answer at this stage. Obviously, there are some questions we cannot yet... I will in a minute, Christine. There are some questions we still cannot yet answer. The third point is, and I've already made this pledge to Duncan McNeill in his role as convener of the committee, that I will report regularly to the committee before 6 months is up. I would hope my first report would be at the end of November, beginning of December, telling the committee progress on all fronts, so that we are absolutely sure we're all moving together on this across the chamber, and that the committee is fully informed and can get the information it needs to monitor our performance in implementing the policy decisions that we've taken.
Christine Graham.
Can I very much welcome the Cabinet Secretary's commitment, but I don't think the public have access to spice. And I think it would be very important, with many questions that have been posed, so far as the Cabinet Secretary is able to answer them in that time scan, is to put them in a publicly accessible area for those maybe on the government's website, so that those who are interested in this debate, and there are many beyond here, are able to see those answers for themselves.
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, that would be no problem whatsoever. It's a very good point, and we will do that. Now, let me try to answer as many questions as I possibly can in the now 6 minutes that I have left. First of all, Christine Graham raised the issue about what happens in the interim. Let me first of all say that I have asked Sir Harry Burns, the Chief Medical Officer, and Professor Bill Scott, the Chief Pharmacist, to provide the guidelines for the new system of PACs as a matter of urgency. So let me first of all stress the urgency. This is not a long-term game in setting up the PACs. It's a short-term game, and the quicker we get them set up, the better. But we will issue interim guidance to the IPTRs, because essentially the single biggest difference between the IPTR system and the new PAC system is that the IPTR system had to show exceptionality vis-à-vis the population measured by the SMC in looking at the drug approval. What the PAC's key criteria is the anticipated clinical outcome for the patient. Now, clearly that, I think, is what makes the difference in terms of not just the decision itself, but the way in which the decision is reached, as well as the fact that it's going to be much more clinically led and clinically decided. And we've also, in our statement yesterday, accepted the original petitioner's recommendations from Tina McGeever that to make sure that patients are properly informed at every stage what their options are and how they can appeal a decision. Secondly, another part of Tina's petition was to improve the turnaround time for decisions, and we will be monitoring that very, very closely. And thirdly, to improve the NHS Inform website so that patients and their carers and their friends and their GPs and others can very quickly find out from the Scottish Government website, NHS Inform website, what they can do to appeal and to help them find their way around the system. So I think all of these detailed proposals we will implement, but I think taken together as a package, it's a very substantive improvement in how the individual patient is dealt with in terms of the appeal process. But we do understand fully and will implement particularly quickly in terms of the guidance for the PACs and getting the PACs set up. Similarly, in terms of the direction I've given to SMC to come back to me by Christmas at the latest in terms of reviewing the quality thresholds, modifying the modifiers, if you like, I will absolutely stick to that timetable, because I honestly believe we do not want, as a Parliament, to get into the position where people who may be caught in between the existing system and the new system pay any penalty because they are in the transition phase.
Duncan McNeill.
How would you expect to overcome that problem, Cabinet Secretary, when those decisions will be constrained with the current modifiers and quality, in that interim period for up to 3 months, maybe?
Cabinet Secretary.
Obviously, the SMC is a very intelligent organisation. They know the desires of the Scottish Government and what the policy intention is, and I'm sure they'll take that into consideration in the meantime. I mean, what's happened this week is actually a very, very good example of, I think, the kind of public interest in this, because the publicity was around the SMC's decision on its latest round of decisions on 3 particular drugs. One was a lung cancer drug, which was approved by the SMC. Another one was a drug to reduce the craving for alcohol. And we are actually the first country in the whole of Europe, not just in the whole of the UK, we are the first country in the whole of Europe to approve that particular drug. And the third one, of course, was on breast cancer, which was the one that was turned down. Now, 2 things. First of all, I cannot comment on that particular drug whether under the new system the SMC would still have turned it down or would have approved it. It would be wrong of me to make a clinical judgment on that matter, and I have no intention of doing so. But obviously, under the new system, they may have approved it, they may have paused, they may have got a patient access scheme that they weren't able to get. A whole host of things might have happened under the new system that wouldn't have happened under the existing system. But just supposing even under the new system, that particular drug had been turned down, the public understanding and the medical world, wider medical world's understanding and the manufacturer's understanding as to the reasons why it has been turned down should be much greater because of the transparency and the openness. And I think that's very, very important indeed. As Willie Coffey rightly said, even under this new, more flexible system, I believe, honestly, there will be drugs that will still be turned down. But I think if people at least know the reasons why they're turned down in much more detail than they do today, then there will be, I think, greater, hopefully, public as well as political, as well as media understanding on why a particular decision has been reached. I think that's an important part of the process.
Duncan McNeill.
I appreciate the Cabinet Secretary's answer, but the transitional period about that issue about whether it be turned down with the new regime or the old regime has not been resolved, other than you would expect the SMC to be taken into cognizance your current position. If you made your current position clear to them.
Cabinet Secretary, your time is nearly up.
Can I say absolutely, totally, unequivocally made it clear to them. And obviously we will be working with the SMC because the chairman of the SMC has made a public statement of endorsing our statement yesterday. So we are talking to people who are on our side on this. The SMC is, as I said earlier, a very intelligent organisation, a world-leading organisation, and they recognise that these additional changes are required to make the system even more robust. Unfortunately, that brings me to the end of my time, but we will put in spice next week detailed responses where we can to the questions that have been raised, but I haven't had time, unfortunately, to answer. And again, thank you all very much indeed for your kind compliments.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Bob Doris to wind up the debate with up to 11 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a privilege to sum up on behalf of the Health and Sport Committee. And let me begin by echoing the thanks made by many in this debate already to all those who provided written and verbal evidence to our committee. I would also wish to thank the Cabinet Secretary for Health, Alec Neil, and his team for their open, their constructive and their listening approach to the work of the Health and Sport Committee. And I think...
Mr Doyle, sorry, could you move your microphone up?
Yes, of course. I think that's sentiments that were echoed by both Jackson Carlow and Willie Coffey during their contributions also. Indeed, the process by which Scotland's Parliament has dealt with this matter in relation to access to medicines really is a demonstration of our Parliament at our best. Now, we've heard talk of the Cabinet Secretary having to make sure the door is large enough to fit his head through when he leaves the chamber. Could I maybe ask Mr Finlay not to leave the chamber at the same time as the Cabinet Secretary, because I thought that the tone of Mr Finlay's contribution leading on behalf of the Labour Party on health shows that we have a real cross-party consensus to move forward on this together. So can I thank him for his contribution? There is light and shade to Mr Finlay's contributions in this Parliament. Yes.
Neil Finlay.
I'll stand up, but I think I may collapse after that intervention. Could I congratulate Mr Doris on the first compliment that I think I've ever had from the SNP benches? Thank you very much for that.
Bob Doris.
I'll hold a stake in the back bench about how long it will be before you get your second compliment, and I'll let you know who wins that. On a more serious note, let us not forget that the report from the Health and Sport Committee is a substantial body of work that we have taken forward, as the convener of our committee has said, in relation to a number of petitions received by our committee via the parliamentary committee system. And our findings are based on robust scrutiny and evidence. Can I say that whilst our committee has not formally considered the Scottish Government's response to our recommendations, given that many of our recommendations that we have made seem to have been accepted by the Scottish Government, I am sure in general terms, if not necessarily in specifics, committee members will welcome much of what is in the response from the Cabinet Secretary. But of course, as the Cabinet Secretary would expect, there will be detailed scrutiny from our committee to follow, and we will also be looking through the official record of this debate to see how best to take that forward as a committee. I'd like to maybe say something about the SMC system more generally. I didn't view it as fixing a system that was broken, but rather improving a system for approval and access to medicines that was considered world-leading. And I think Malcolm Chisholm made that point within his debate. We looked at the quality-adjusted life year. We've heard much of that during this debate, and we had discussions at committee in relation to that, and we said in paragraph 71 of our report that no one argued that there was a better system than the QALY for assessing the value offered by competing treatments. However, despite that assertion by our committee, the next three words in that quote, which remains incomplete, are vital, because they were despite its limitations. And what our committee sought to do was to move forward beyond those limitations. That is why the committee urged the Scottish Government to, and I quote, review as a matter of priority how modifiers and thresholds are applied to better take account of orphan and ultra-orphan conditions, end-of-life and innovation. And I'm delighted to hear, yes, of course, we want the detailed Cabinet Secretary, but I'm delighted to hear that the SMC has already started that process and that we expect a report back to the Cabinet Secretary before Christmas. The committee decided that this was a pressing matter, and I'm glad to see that the Government appears to have moved speedily in relation to that. I wanted to raise, Presiding Officer, specifically that matter of modifiers and thresholds first, as only to focus on the IPTR system would be to ignore a key issue within our inquiry, and that is why were certain medicines being turned down for approval by the Scottish Medicines Consortium in the first place, and as a result, in my opinion, leading to the IPTR process being used as a backdoor approval mechanism for which it was never designed. If I could refer to the point made repeatedly by Eric Lowe of Myeloma UK in giving evidence to our committee, and I'm not quoting directly, rather from memory, Presiding Officer, he said we need to design a system that gets more yeses by the SMC first time, but in a fair and in a consistent manner. I believe the review of the QALY modifiers, combined with a number of other matters which we'll discuss shortly, we achieve that. Firstly, the pause in the SMC process. The NICE process in England has a pause within the process where, if it looks as if discussions between the pharma companies and NICE are not going to lead to a yes, they have a pause in the process to reconsider positions rather than taking entrenched positions. A sensible proposal that I'm glad to see the Government is taken forward, and also recommendations which we'll return to if there's time in relation to taking a wider view of value and cost effectiveness in relation to approval of medicines within Scotland. I'd like to turn to an issue that had the prospect of being controversial, but given the sensitive way in which our committee handled the matter, did not turn out to be so. And that is the matter of a cancer drugs fund in England and end-of-life conditions. I was going to read out quotes from the report, but due to time constraints, I'm not going to do that. But the committee unanimously ruled out a cancer drugs fund in Scotland. I pay tribute to Annette Millen for sensitively handling how we got forward to that position in a cross-party consensus. Needless to say that the committee agreed that we should not single out any end-of-life condition, but rather we should improve our system in a fair, a consistent and an evidence-based manner. And that is why the committee ruled out a cancer drugs fund. And I've already spoken about how there will be an enhanced modifier with the Scottish Medicines Consortium to take greater cognizance of end-of-life conditions. But that is, of course, only part of the solution to dealing better with end-of-life conditions and cancer in particular. Any system will not always say yes, as we've heard, so individual patient treatment requests become crucial also. In para 62, we make reference in our report to a number of recommendations which leans towards wanting a national system of individualised patient treatment requests and a desire to move away from exceptionality, as we've heard speak of in the Chamber today. We believed that exceptionality was a flawed basis in which to move forward with patient treatment requests. I have to say the Cabinet Secretary's response to these recommendations perhaps is to rip up the IPTR system. So we will now have to, as a committee, take a decision on the peer-approved clinical system, which I think intuitively I'm drawn towards. And I think we had a number of examples in the chamber today where clinicians said there is a strong evidence base. This end-of-life medicine will make a material difference to my patient, yet they were still refused that drug, that medicine for that end-of-life condition. Well, if the peer-approved clinical system does what it appears to say on the tin, that will become a thing of the past, and I warmly welcome that. But the committee, of course, will have to hold our position to look in more detail about how that will be rolled out. I would also ask the Cabinet Secretary to give consideration, just as my convener Duncan McNeill said, about the use of modifiers with the SMC process in lieu of the new system coming into place, to how area drug and therapeutic committees will view exceptionality in that transitional period until the peer-approved clinical system comes into place. My strong call, and whilst I don't have the permission of a convener, I'm sure I can speak with consensus with the committee, that we would expect every area drug and therapeutic committee to take cognizance of peer-approved clinical recommendation for drugs now and not wait till the formal system comes into place. I think I'm in safe ground for our committee if I was to say that. There are one or two other things I want to refer to, Presiding Officer. One of them is the delay on medicines that are approved by the SMC finding their way onto the local formulary. And here actually is one of the few instances in my reading of the Cabinet Secretary's response to the committee where the Cabinet Secretary doesn't actually stay on the same ground as the committee on this one. The committee looked at the idea of a national formulary available locally and to be available in a consistent and ready matter within the 30-day period as set out. The Cabinet Secretary is given assurances in relation to the speed of which medicines will put on a local formulary, but not necessarily any acceptance of a national formulary. Although I did note in the Scottish Government's response that the Cabinet Secretary did talk about certain medicines with key clinical importance through discussions and agreement of relevant specialities within NHS Scotland to ensure outcomes for patients in all parts of Scotland are optimised will be made available on a national basis out with the local formulary. So
Final minute, Mr Doris.
Moving part of the way towards what the committee recommended, but not quite, and the committee will of course have to look at that. Can I finish with the time I have left in talking about value-based pricing? Well, to be kind to the UK Government, it has unravelled slightly, but let's not dwell on that. Let's look forward as a Scottish Parliament and as a committee and as a government. We have to better capture the value of medicines in Scotland. When we give a patient a medicine, there is an on-benefit to that. Does that patient, as one of my constituents, would benefit? Will they no longer be in a wheelchair? If they are no longer in a wheelchair with that medicine, what is the on-savings to the local authority? What are the on-savings to the NHS? What are the on-benefits to society? Right now, none of that is captured. And I am delighted that the Cabinet Secretary has indicated we will move to a Scottish model of value to capture real value in relation to what is cost-effective and beneficial and desirable for society. I do see this as a groundbreaking moment in relation to this Parliament and this Government and how we address access to medicines in Scotland. And like Jackson Carlaw, I think this will endure and it will make a substantial difference to the lives of our constituents. And it's a pleasure to close the debate, but I do look forward to ongoing scrutiny on behalf and with the Health and Sports Committee.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate on access to new medicines, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 7952 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a business programme. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 7952. Minister.
Formally moved.
Many thanks. I have a member who wishes to speak against the motion, and I call on Paul Martin.
Presiding Officer, I rise on behalf of the Scottish Labour Party to oppose the business motion in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Bureau. At the Bureau, on behalf of the Labour Party, I requested a statement on a number of questions that remain unanswered in connection with the Glasgow Airport Railway link. The Scottish Government have now confirmed that they have no intention of agreeing to a statement in Parliament, and apparently they have nothing further to say in this matter. Presiding Officer, I think it's a very sad day in Parliament if the Government cancel a project at a cost of £30 million to the public purse, then they do not believe that they have a responsibility to answer to this Parliament. Can I also say, Presiding Officer, I think all of us agree that the Parliament hear many statements. Many of us have judgments on whether those statements have been effective and been able to answer questions on behalf of the Government. And afterwards, it's for all of us, including the public, to judge on those statements. The Government haven't come forward with a proposal to answer to us on this occasion. Presiding Officer, the only conclusion that we can reach in that respect is that the Scottish Government have something to hide, and they are not willing to come forward to this Parliament. Nothing to say, and want to come forward, and they have something to hide. Presiding Officer, I oppose the business motion in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. And I now call on Joe Fitzpatrick to respond.
Presiding Officer, I am frustrated the Labour Party feels it necessary to bring this to the Chamber and to oppose business. The Scottish Government has been upfront with the costs and savings of the cancellation of the Glasgow Airport rail link since September 2009. Presiding Officer, the information is already in the public domain. The Labour Party are more than aware of the many procedures that allow them to hold the Government to account, and I would urge them to use those procedures. In addition, it is entirely within Labour's gift to use their time to debate whatever takes their fancy. Perhaps the Labour Party might like to consider spending some of their debating time defending their plans for a bridge to Ireland as outlined by Anne McTaggart. Or maybe, and more seriously, maybe they would like to spend some of their time defending their position on tolls on the Forth Bridge and the new Queensferry crossing, which Arthur Midwinter suggested is under consideration by the Labour's Cuts Commission. Presiding Officer, the Labour Party really needs to get a grip. I move the business on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau.
I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 7952 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, and therefore we will move to a vote, and I would be grateful if members could cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 7952 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick is yes 66, no 24. There were no abstentions, and the motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is consideration of 3 Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 7954 and 7955 on approval of SSIs and motion number 7956 on designation of lead committee. Minister.
Moved on block.
Thank you. The question on these motions will be put at decision time, to which we now come. And there are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion 7954 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion 7955 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. And the next question is that motion 7956 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the designation of a lead committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. And that concludes decision time. We will now move on to members' business, and I would be most grateful if members who are leaving the chamber could do so quietly, please.